Welcome everyone to our first webinar in the Climate Justice Coalition series, Planting the Seeds of Justice. This is the introductory webinar titled The Promise of Fairness, and we have Lungisa Ngapi in conversation with Matshidiso Lencoasa. And this series is looking at economic justice and climate justice, and it emerged from the Economic Justice Working Group of the Climate Justice Coalition, where we've been talking about the need for having deeper, more critical conversations in the climate space about the state of economic justice, given our history in South Africa and how that interlinks with climate justice. And in the working group, we've been highlighting how these discussions really need to be taking place in a public platform. And that's kind of the background for how this series emerged. So just to give some of you a background who may not be familiar, I think there are a number of familiar names in the audience, but for those who are not familiar with the Climate Justice Coalition, it is an amalgamation of 50 trade unions, youth organizations, faith and community-based groups, grassroots and independent activists, as well as international and local non-governmental organizations. And we share a common goal within the coalition to push forward a transformative climate justice agenda, which works to overcome the deep inequality, poverty, and multiple injustices that South Africa faces. And Tidi, who is from Section 27, so I'm going to give a bit of a background on Section 27. It's a public interest law center that seeks to achieve substantive equality and social justice in South Africa. It's guided by the principles and values in the Constitution. And Section 27 uses law, advocacy, legal literacy, research, and community mobilization to achieve access to healthcare services and basic education. They aim to achieve structural change and accountability to ensure the dignity and equality of everyone. In a climate change context where the right to basic education and access to healthcare services is threatened by increasing frequency of extreme weather events, Section 27 contemplates how to wield the power of funding allocations to ensure that these rights are protected for all in South Africa. So before I introduce our panelists, I just want to ask people to please share your expectations for this webinar. I think we might need to use the Q&A section because I think the chat seems to be limited to the hosts and panelists. So if you have expectations for this webinar series, for this webinar in particular, please write in the Q&A section so that we can have a bit more of an interactive element in the way that we are taking this session forward. And of course, we will also have an open question and answer session after hearing our conversation between our two speakers. So finally, getting to our introduction, Chidi is a budget researcher at Section 27. We're very lucky to have her joining us today. She advocates for budget interventions that protect the constitutional rights to basic education and healthcare in a climate change context. She currently serves on the steering committees of the Budget Justice Coalition, which intends to advance people's participation and understanding of budget processes, and Imali Yetu's, which is a civil society collaboration with National Treasury to make budget information more accessible. She forms part of the Fiscal Openness Accelerators Advisory Group, which works to deepen public participation in the budget process, and she is a 2023 Mandela Washington Fellow. And she will be in conversation with Lungisa, who is an independent activist, formerly part of Extinction Rebellion, who is currently a friend of the Climate Justice Coalition and co-facilitates the Economic Justice Working Group. And he has a strong interest in bringing decolonial perspectives into economic and climate justice conversations. So I think I might hand over to Lungisa. I'm noting that we don't have yet any expectations shared in the Q&A section. So I might suggest that we revisit this after the conversation, and then we can see what people have expected and whether we've met those expectations. But I'll pass it over to you, Lungisa.
I'm having a problem here. I can't see what's going on. And I'm not sure. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, because I couldn't hear myself. Apologies to that. So a warm welcome to everybody that's here today. Thank you so much. I guess I'd like to begin by thanking the CJC for allowing me to have this space and inviting me to have this critical conversation about economic justice. I see a few comrades out there, so hi, thanks for coming. In the time that we have together, I'd like to call on us to have a chat, conversate, discuss, and critically analyze the assumptions that inform the economic justice discourse. In this talk, I hope to simultaneously acknowledge the contribution that the human rights discourse, the SDGs, the constitutional discourse makes in advancing our imaginations of what economic justice actually means. But at the same time, I want to critique the hegemony, speaking to all the forces that maintain these structures and frameworks, right? And their colonizing effects, and draw attention to that. That's my introduction. And from there, I would like to go straight to some questions. But before I do that, I'm having a bit of trouble with my with what's going on in front of me with the tech. Things aren't working properly for me. Can you just lift your finger up if you can still hear me? Because I can't hear myself.
We can hear you, Lungisa. You can just go ahead, I think.
So to start off and begin with my first question, I had tried to figure out how I would begin my first question, and where I went straight to the title of this webinar. The idea of the premise of fairness, South Africa of apartheid and the transition to democracy raised a lot of hopes, and we understand today, like, a lot of that hope was false. 94 was intended to be a just transition, but a lot of marginalized communities, if not erased, were left behind, and to this day they continue to face economic hardships and social disparities. So my question to Tsidi, the first one would be, how can we ensure that the just transition to a sustainable and equitable economy does not perpetuate the historical marginalizations and exclusions of vulnerable communities as experienced during the previous transitions in South Africa? Cheers.
Thank you so much for that, Lungisa. I hope everyone can hear me. I'll just keep talking and there's, okay, great. Thank you so much. And thank you to the Climate Justice Coalition for having us. We're big fans of the work that the CJC does. And I think that it's a really great way to really answer this question that Lungisa has posed to me. But before I do, I'd just like to give a disclaimer that I woke up with a bit of a sore throat. So if you see me drinking my ginger tea or anything, I hope that's okay. Back to answering the question. I really do appreciate the way that you had framed this just transition that, you know, as South Africa, we are in a unique position where we have experienced a transition before that aimed to be just, and now we experience another, like, as apartheid ended, how do we transition into a democratic South Africa? And in that, I think, you know, in hindsight, we can tell that South Africa still, like, the legacies of apartheid are still entrenched in our society, be it unemployment, inequality, and poverty. You know, things are still, while there have been steps that have been made, there's still a lot that needs to be done in order for everyone to enjoy the fruits of of this democracy. And so this just energy transition is an opportunity, or we could frame it as an opportunity to really not only, you know, transition into a free, fair society with all, you know, all the ideals that we have, but also maybe to rectify some of the times or the issues that we had in the past where, you know, we hadn't, you know, to rectify all the entrenched legacies. Maybe we can transition into a society that's equal, you know, maybe a society that's, you know, that does, like, unemployment isn't actually, you know, doesn't plague us like that, in a society where marginalized people do not bear the burden of policy. And in order to ensure that, I think about two people who said things that Wangari Maathai, she is a Nobel Peace Prize winner, the first African woman to win a Nobel Peace Prize. And she said that we are called to assist the earth to heal her wounds, and in the process to heal our own. And the time for humanity to shift to a new level of consciousness is now. And also Albert Einstein gets paraphrased a lot as saying that you cannot solve a problem with the same mind or the same thinking that you use to create it. So we, you know, and he elaborates that we need a new type of thinking that's essential if we are going to survive as a species and move towards high levels. So really, this is an opportunity now with the just transition to reflect on where we, you know, dropped the ball in terms of in the last transition that we had as a country, but also to look towards a society, like, how can we ensure that people are not left behind? We can create policies and allocate resources in a way that actually entrenches, like, the people who are most affected by it, ensuring that we don't perpetuate it. We can be more conscious and more intentional about both the policy making as well as the implementation, to ensure that the most impoverished people, the most marginalized and most vulnerable communities in this country are actually advanced with this transition. You know, we don't want to see the same, you know, a post-carbon society, but then, you know, it's still the same thinking, it's still the same unemployment, still the same issues of lack of access to education and healthcare.
And I guess that's a interesting way to move into our second question. Before I get that part of that question, I'd like to point out that, you know, as a CJC, our baseline is basically decolonial already. Okay, my computer says the internet connection is unstable. You can hear me, right?
We can now.
You guys, the weather here is horrible in Quebec. Anyway, so we as the CJC are already at the decolonial perspective, which basically means we already perceive the instruments of change that have been used since, you know, 1994 as lacking. So my next question becomes, in what ways does the human rights narrative, the South African Constitution, the SDGs framework in South Africa actually address the root causes of the economic disparities, land dispossession, environmental degradation that are inherited? Because these things aren't just happening, right? They're inherited from colonialism and apartheid. And do you think that they can be transformed to advance economic and climate justice? Taking into account what I started with, that we kind of assume that they can't be. This is where the systems change question comes in. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think it's a really topical question right now. There's a lot of reflection by our generation, by young people, about the Constitution of South Africa and whether it is relevant, or whether, is it actually, there's criticism, even though, or conversations around that, even though that it is a document or a constitution that's been largely praised globally. And I actually have spoken to someone who formed part of the creation of the Constitution, and it gave me a different perspective. And that is that the Constitution, these frameworks, the SDGs not so much, because they were formulated, they're ongoing, so they don't have the same entrenched issue, I'd say. But overall, these policies, this legislation, I think that one way to really look at it is to see them as like living documents. Like, it's a baseline of what we're able to do, like access and like ensuring that there's adequate access for healthcare and education towards everyone, but also knowing that when it comes to implementation, or when it comes, like, we have quite a progressive constitution, but we can always do better, especially when it comes to implementing the policies that come from that. And one of the policy pieces that is supposed to be entrenched by in the Constitution is our national budget and how we allocate funding. So funding should be allocated in a way that reflects ensures that people's rights, constitutional rights to a variety of things, including education and healthcare, are protected. And so I think that, sorry, I hope that there's no background noise. But yeah, I think that now is a good opportunity to reflect on how we can use the national budget, or all the policies that come from that are entrenched in the Constitution, to ensure that it actually, like, those constitutional rights are fulfilled. As for the SDGs and the Sustainable Development Goals, I think that it's also really interesting to reflect on that, because I think they were finalized in 2015, and so one of the things is, like, they're supposed to be like quite recent and theoretically more progressive in that way. However, when you actually look at 2030, like, we're actually like quite close. We're closer to 2030 than we are to when they were enacted. And I think for that reason, like, there's, you don't really have all the answers regarding that, but I think that it is important to start reflecting on how where we went wrong, because it looks like we're not going to reach a world where there is no poverty or any of those goals that we've achieved. And think about, like, what tools, like, where do we go wrong? Is it our implementation of this policy? Have we been allocating funding to ensuring that these policies or these goals are actually realized?
Yeah, cheers. Thank you for that. I'm going to jump onto something that you said there. I agree with you, and I want to add on that I also believe, like, for example, that the 2030 agenda is no doubt going to fail. And I don't think anybody could say anything different to that. But my question then becomes, so these frameworks then, whether it's the human rights narrative, the Constitution, how do you see how they perpetuate the power dynamics that we've inherited from colonialism, and can they be transformed to advance an economic and a climate justice agenda? Considering that, like, as I say, that the idea of 2030 and the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals Agenda 2030, as we can see that is going to fail. It's not going to make it on time, just like the millennial goals didn't make it on time. And what we don't want is for these instruments of change to become part of a PR campaign, right? So, like, that's what I'd like to ask is do you see these instruments inherited or not, and how can they be changed if they are? Cheers.
I think it cut out for a bit for me, but I just want to make sure that I got the question. So you're asking about the human rights narrative and the SDGs, and how, like, those power dynamics have been inherited, and how we can transform that to advance economic justice, right?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So that's also really good question, because yes, in South Africa, we know it all too well in terms of post-apartheid. We think our freedom was attained like 94, which is relatively recent. However, we operate in a global economic system, and where we have and maybe I'll be a little bit more controversial, but there's a fact also is that some countries definitely wield a lot more power than others, and those countries also typically tend to be those that benefited from the settler colonialism structure of power. And so what that means is that I think when it comes to the human rights narrative, and we can talk in detail about who actually shapes that narrative, that top-down approach where decisions are being made on behalf of the rest of the world in like of the majority of the world, or of regarding like a lived experience that many of those people do not know. And so that's, I think we've spoken quite at length about that, not necessarily in this webinar, but just in general, the development space is reflecting on that. And I think one ways to advance, like it's not a lost cause, but we do need to reflect on reform versus revolution. Is it possible to reform our global system in such a way that everyone is an equal participant and everyone comes to the table equally, or do we need a complete revolution or reflection on how because I just want to talk through that a little bit, is that even with South African constitution has tried, but I think we can do a lot better, and our policies are quite progressive, but I do think that we can do better. And one of the ways is that often indigenous knowledge systems are not actually prioritized, and it's concerning, because you live in South Africa. Where else, if we're not prioritizing indigenous knowledge systems, then where else? Because we have access to so much of it. And when it comes to actually solving these problems, I think one of the issues is that then policies are implemented or formulated from a top-down thing. So they're formulated in Pretoria or in Cape Town or away, but they exclude the lived realities of the people who are experiencing that policy, but also how these communities have resolved issues like this in the past. So sustainability, I'll give an example. I think there's a lot of greenwashing with companies about how do we actually achieve this. But if you actually look at real sustainability practices and ask yourself, in Africa, we've been around for thousands of years, for the longest. There are it's a sustainable population. What did our ancestors do right? And one of the theories that they use is whatever we take from the earth, we need to replenish. So, they used to mine back in the day, but, all the gold that was taken to make jewelry, after that, when someone gets buried, they must be buried with it almost as we've loaned that from the earth and we give it back. Or how societies were a little bit more nomadic and rooted around trees. So there's some societies where, the umbilical cord of a child would get cut and buried in a tree, and then that tree full circle moments in a few years' time, when someone passes on, they're buried in that tree as well. So the point that I'm making with these examples is that there are actually so many voices in the world, including our voices, where we can learn so much about sustainability. We have done it before, we've been alive for long. And unfortunately, a lot of the human rights narrative, a lot of policy tends to divorce that. And so one of the ways that we can really transform these living documents to advance economic justice and all of that is to both center the experiences of people, but also listen to them, to the people who are most affected, because they actually may have those solutions, and not to undermine some of the things that actually worked in our favor in the past. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So let's chat. So yeah, as you say, then these frameworks that we're using then are generally not using or they're not based from indigenous perspectives, right? We've inherited Western centric ways of being, and as such we've created solutions for our problems that use these ways of dealing problems. And we see, right, today now, the solution arcing, right? So my question to you, the underlying assumptions and the logics that follow these frameworks that we're trying to use for justice, do they align in the context of South Africa with the problems that we have? And on top of that, do they align with addressing, economic and climate justice? And if they do, how do they, considering that they don't use our knowledges and they don't pay attention to our problems from our perspective? They tend to be top down as opposed to, as people say, grassroots, which is kind of the opposite of top down and want to say up, but we're trying to find a way of being we all share together. Cheers. If that makes sense.
Yes, I hope I answered correctly, because I think my internet cut out a bit, but if I don't, please correct me. But I mean, to start off, like reflecting on the SDGs, we mentioned earlier that they're quite recent. And so what that means is, like, my personal position is that they're great and there are ways that they can be better. One of the ways that they work really well is like how interconnected they are. So it's based off of the assumption of interconnectedness. Like, we can't have economic prosperity or social progress without environmental protection. Those things, like, I think they have definitely gotten right. And I believe someone in the chat, in the Q&A, also asked about that, but we can explore that a little bit further later. So those assumptions in that way, they do work. However, like, we in South Africa, but like globally, have an issue in terms of how we implement these progressive policies. I think right now, for instance, I'll look at the JETP, and one of the issues is that initially, it's seen as like, it's very exciting, raising funding, maybe we can move away from this carbon heavy economy. And I grew up in Witbank, by the way, so this is something that's like also like very personal for me, and I know like the effects of like being around like coal a lot on the health and everything. So so there's like a lot of, it was something that's supposed to be exciting, especially if it was entrenched in the SDGs and it was like international. However, I think a few months in or years in, we're now seeing, I mean, it's quite wishy-washy. Like, we don't know as much about like the JP, but the view is that most of that funding is going to be in the form of loans, maybe debt that is not going to be, it won't be as hectic as what they would get if they went right onto the market, so below market rates, but still debt nonetheless. And in South Africa, we already have National Treasury cutting spending or allocations to education and healthcare and other human rights, because they're saying, oh, we're trying to pay off our debts. We increase, our interest on debt because we are bailing out Eskom or whatever state-owned entity, and, debt. However, now, we're taking on even more debt, and we're taking on this debt that's denominated in dollars and in euros, international debt. And so we worry about, like, what does that mean in terms of implementation for the next generation? Have we considered that? Does that mean, like, what does that mean for the sovereignty of our country? Can we take on all of this debt without like a democratic process, for instance? And I guess the rant is all this to say that we have like great assumptions and all this, like, ideal world of like SDG 1, like no poverty and economic prosperity and all of those things, and we want to buy into that. But as soon as, when it's time to make those decisions, yes, South Africa's fiscal framework and like how we make budget decisions is quite problematic, but also, like internationally, like, do we have the same power? Like, is it fair to take on, like, we are a country, actually, like, we're established because we're producing all this mining stuff to the rest of these countries, and now it seems like the future South Africans are going to be paying for that in the form of this debt. But yeah, that's my rant.
Yeah, no, yeah, and when it comes to that, and like, and maybe let's problematize this, right? Like, so it sounds then to me, especially coming from, a decolonial perspective, that let me focus on the Constitution, then it is inherently flawed, right? Like the historical injustices and the next then the trying to deal with those injustices seems we're using frameworks that inevitably must fail, right? Like and I say that obviously from a positionality of, you know, that I'm in, but at the same time what I'm trying to point out is that the South African Constitution is celebrated as one of the most progressive documents in the world, because it's supposed to be, you know, all the everybody. But actually 20-something years later, almost years, is that it doesn't work that way. So the question to you becomes, as a framework, does the Constitution work at all? And taking into account that I'm, of course, I'm being a little bit combative in my questioning, but I do appreciate that we are in a transition since 94 and a little bit before, and you know it's projected further that this is a transition. But the Constitution itself, does it work for us? It's underlying assumptions, right? Do they work towards economic justice for the majority? And as a, how do you say, a question, just to cover the whole entire question, does it promote justice for those that are marginalized and have always been marginalized? And to be clear about that, I mean brown and black indigenous folk. Cheers.
Yeah, so I mean, like stated earlier, you know, the Constitution, you know, it was of its time, it was that transition, and sorry, I apologize. My throat.
No.
And it made a lot of sense in the context that they found. Obviously, as we grow older and as people grow, like, you know, we unlearn things, or we learn things, or we learn more about, you know, the legacies of apartheid. We also start giving voice to other voices that, you know, weren't ordinarily part of the process. And so with consultation, yes, there could be better consultation. We see that, you know, there are ways that policies and like the Constitution falls short, and it's good to have these conversations. I would say though that my issue, you know, like just from a budget perspective or fiscal policy perspective, isn't actually just, you know, the Constitution itself as a document, because it does protect, particularly what we're interested in Section 27, is the right to access to healthcare and basic education. The problem, though, is that, you know, the policies that follow that, or you know, like the implementation of those policies ends up falling quite short. Firstly, you know, budget policies, there's, you know, reduced allocations towards protecting these rights, and then it makes you wonder to what document, like what do we hold government officials accountable to if they're not, you know, aggressively advocating for the constitutional rights. There's that, and then there's also the way that I think just implementation, so not just the quantity is spent, but definitely the quality. So even as we shape these kind of conversations, they tend to have it happen in Pretoria, Johannesburg, Cape Town. You know, when I was growing up, this was like very far removed to even have, like, I don't remember either government or civil society ever, like, you know, being in our spaces outside of a few HIV/AIDS campaigns. But it, you know, a lot of the country gets removed from that. And so when you don't give voice to the people who are most affected by those policies, it just means that, and an adequate voice also, not just like tick box exercise, but like and talk shops, but like an adequate voice and genuine engaging, and without the assumption that people are inferior or that kind of thing, you'll find that I think that would be a lot better in terms of shaping policies that actually serve or that center the people that we're trying to advocate for. I think the just energy transition, like a lot of the wording is very, you know, like quite pro, like the areas around like the mining areas, like does bring out the concerns that people have about like losing jobs if they were dependent on the informal economy. But when it comes to funding, the funding that follows that, it doesn't really reflect that. In fact, it's quite concerning, because then it's like, oh, so not only are we not going to, like, it looks like we won't have jobs, or these things are going to be entrenched. The constitutional rights to education, healthcare are not prioritized, but also we're sitting with a lot more debts. So what was the point of all of that? But yeah, my reflections. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, that yeah, that makes me think in terms now. I want to move a little bit where I go. You know, the decolonial perspective calls for us to reevaluate, right? Like the dominant power dynamics and the assumptions that shape those frameworks, right? And I'd like to go towards the legal framework, right? Because it's kind of important in considering what we're talking about. And again, I would like to point out to the folks really setting the scene we're going to be having, and that we have this conversation in a way to talk about many different things that we can move that. So my question to you is, from a decolonial perspective, and the assumption that, you know, that these power dynamics that we've inherited are inherently flawed in the way that that I see them anyway, and we see them. How then can we use the decolonial perspective to challenge and make some change? Like, how do we do that if that's possible to be answered? Cheers.
Yeah, that's a really good question. But yeah, I mean, where to start? I think there's something in the chat asking me to go audio. Okay. And I also saw a lot of the Q&A questions, and they seem very interesting. So I'm really looking forward to engaging with everyone on that. But yeah, to tackle the more difficult question about using decolonization, it is very complicated. Not complicated rather, but it seems like a daunting task when, you know, for the past 400, 500, 600 years, you know, we've been using one way of thinking that hasn't really been working as well. Like, some things have worked, but overall has just entrenched, like, the majority of the world lives below the poverty food line. So we, you know, we have a real issue to address, and we also do have, like, resources. You know, some countries have huge issues when it comes to, like, too much food and wastage, in other countries, you know, and certain communities are not getting enough food. So there's definitely we require a shift in terms of, like, the way that we approach these things. As to how we do it, I think when it, like, practical steps of decolonization, is that this conversation, I think for me, I was introduced to it, like, during Feast Must Fall and afterwards, and I've seen huge strides that have been made in that. At first, you know, the thoughts, I even remember some of the comments online were, you know, quite racist, of like, oh, what, you know, science, a decolonial science, what does that mean, or anything. But now you find universities like the University of Pretoria has a course on astronomy, the way that Botswana used to look at it, right? Like, back in the day. And you'll see that there are scientific knowledge systems and indigenous knowledge systems that are available, you know, in museums and everything. And I think it's not just about, like, absorbing, but, like, reflecting on, oh, what did they know, or what have they tried and tested that resulted in that? So with education, for instance, there's that African proverb, and I'm, like, really paraphrasing it, about how if you educate a girl child, you educate a nation. And we look at that and we're like, oh, that's really wise. But I think, you know, we can take it steps further and, like, reflect on it as, like, oh, that was a policy decision back in the day, you know, that predate, like, that was decolonial. So I think there is, I mean, it's a pity that some of the knowledge has been both hidden, you know, out of protection, but also destroyed by the very systems that want to continue entrenching these power dynamics. But I think if we look inward and look at, you know, like, the day-to-day thing, especially in South Africa, like, there's so much wisdom to be gained. And when you take, like, for instance, a practical way to implement that is, so we know that if you educate a girl child, you educate a nation. Like, based on that African proverb, there's a theory, or, like, there's policy implications on education, and there's policy implications on gender equality, right? And so in that way, that means, like, when we formulate policies like a gender responsive budget, for example, national budget, what does that look like, would be a question. But if you look back and look at that quote, for instance, and entrench that and see that policy, you'll know that, oh, you know, a gender responsive budget that's according to a decolonial way of looking at things would be education. It centers education. So allocation of funding towards education would be really, really important. Or, you know, and it also looks at like gender, so a girl child. So that kind of seems like really complicated, but if we stop rushing and like over consuming things on Twitter or like the news, and actually stop and think like what actually has been working and what can we actually bring back, what can we advance in this society, yeah, I think we can make great strides in decolonizing climate change policy. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a great answer, actually. It makes a lot of sense in what you were saying, and it allows me to go into the next question, which would be, you know, the ecofeminist perspective sort of it recognizes the, you know, the interconnections between gender, ecology, and, you know, social justice. So my question becomes, in what ways then can the ecofeminist perspective, how do you say, inform and enrich the discussions that we're trying to have around economic and climate justice in the South African context? And how can it help challenge the extractive and exploitative practices that we have sort of inherited from colonialism? And I asked that question stepping on to what you were just saying about decolonization, because I want to move from decolonization to ecofeminism, because they kind of, you know, they work together. Cheers.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's really important to talk about ecofeminism, and not just like as a side thought, but actually to center it, because while climate change affects everyone, and, you know, and will continue to affect everyone if we don't intervene appropriately, the burden of climate change is carried in this country, is carried by impoverished Black women, particularly those who live in the rural areas, because of agricultural norms, gender norms, a variety of things. And it is very important that we don't look at it as a side thought, but actually center that in our response, our mitigation, our adaptation strategies, our litigation, and like how we legislation, and how we actually implement all of that and how we allocate funding. We need to make sure that it's rooted or centered around like the people who are most affected by it, because if we don't, again, we'll just entrench that gender inequality that we, you know, that has and other forms of inequality that are in our society, and just move them on to the next in the next transition, which then no longer becomes just. And so the ways that as a gender, you know, as a more budget policy side, a fiscal policy side, a big part of it is to allocate funding in a way that centers that recognizes some of the that recognizes the inequalities and how it persists. How do women disproportionately carry that burden? And also, you know, we can extend that. I think when you do have that kind of thinking, you can even extend it to like more global international policy of like, you know, this continent emits what, 5% but of global emissions. Please don't quote me. I think that was the last stats that I saw. But then, you know, we carry the burden as a continent more than any others. And the reaction to that is, oh, let's give them more debt to fix it. It's not really centering on the people, like the people who carry the burden of the debt. So really what I'm saying is that what you can take from this is that it's very important to be intentional about how different, you know, how this manifests, how these different things manifest, instead of overlooking it, because it, you know, if we actually want to solve the problem, we should actually hear it from like the people who disproportionately carry that burden. And I think the closer we get to that, the more we realize like what the actual roots of the problem is. And, you know, the problem is actually like the system. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that. That allows me actually to move to the next question. You know, speaking to economic justice, we can't have a conversation about economic justice without talking about land reform in this country, right? So, I mean, land reform is a critical aspect of addressing the economic inequalities in this country. So my question then becomes, how can the principles of economic justice be integrated into, sort of land reform initiatives here in this country? And how can these initiatives promote equitable access to the resources that need to empower people?
I'll restate my disclaimer that, as Section 27 budget research, I focus specifically on education and healthcare. So my response on land reform might be like quite shallow, but I'm very passionate in the sense like, I rally behind it. And I think when it comes to the conversation around land, very important conversation to have. But again, when it comes to the legislation and the policy, I don't think that we have been speaking enough about the gendered implications or the identity. What does that look like, in rural areas, because of, again, gendered norms. So there is, like access to land, but there's a whole conversation about how land allocations work in the post-apartheid South Africa. But with this land, like in rural areas, we find that people, women are responsible for doing work like fetching water from the river, fetching firewood, that kind of thing, and so are more exposed to the harmful impacts of climate change. So in responding or formulating a land reform policy, whatever way we do it, I'm sure the experts, and if there are any, I'd be happy to hear from, but we shouldn't overlook how, different people in this country interact with it differently, and to center like the people who are most, whose land was stolen, all of those things, to center them in the conversation and not overlook important things like gendered norms that have been entrenched, and how do we actually resolve that? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I'd also just like to add to you, and as part of the conversation, as we speak about economic justice, especially from a decolonial perspective, it becomes about removing those forces, those structures, those frameworks that limit people and stop them from getting that type of justice, right? Because the limitations to that justice, they're not natural. They're not just happening. They're happening because of capitalism, right? As one type of framework that creates that situation. So so to speak to the question of land, and I get what you're saying about how it's a pretty difficult question to answer. And I just like to add, and that's the big part of the question that we have as a society, as civil society, having this conversation about economic justice. Land is a huge problem, a huge question that we need to deal with, but that also is how we frame land, how we frame colonialism, right? Like most people think of colonialism as the theft of land, whereas from a decolonial perspective, it really is about reframing reality, changing the way people see things, messing with ways of being and destroying them. So that leads me to the next question: to how can grassroots movements and community-led initiatives contribute to achieving economic and climate justice in South Africa, and what support and resources are needed to empower those initiatives?
Yeah, so I'll speak from a policy perspective, from the policy space. I found that when it comes to community initiatives, or actually if we think about our society, when we do policy, I think, even I'm guilty of it, is looking at it from a top-down approach, from like the policy all the way down to how it trickles down to the people. And so I'm looking at like the national budget and how that gets allocated. Then I'm looking at provincial, then local, instead of, when there's a crisis, like for instance, I'll use the KZN and Eastern Cape floods that happened last year, where schools and hospitals were destroyed. I think the first thinking, or how I could be better and how the policy space could be better, the fiscal policy space, is to reflect on what interventions, like when these things happen, when government falls short, when all of this happens, like what is actually happening in the community to prevent that. So, okay, hospitals have been destroyed. What happens in the interim? Like, what are people doing? And you find that actually, when it comes to, yes, they're grassroots, organizations and movements, but also just there's something about humanity and human nature. So I'll even that just when it comes to crisis, that just goes against the underlying implicit economic assumptions, which goes into that. I will answer also if we get to one of the Q&As that also has to do with that. But for instance, like with education, right? Like in schools, like in township areas, especially during apartheid, there were a lot of people who worked in town, as a domestic worker, as a helper, whatever it is, and so didn't have a chance to raise their children, and so there were a lot of children on the streets. And one of the interventions is that a lot of women started, particularly Black women, started taking in and creating ECD centers, and that forms the ECD landscape of South Africa today, which is quite unique compared to the rest of the country. And why I bring that example up is that there's always a lot happening on the ground every day, right? Like we live in society, we know that when there's something bad that happens, people jump in and respond. And that's the thing, the society that we live in, and the world is this sort of inequality and unemployment is so unsustainable that we should have collapsed long ago as a society, but people intervene. And so when those interventions come in, you also see we can learn so much from the different interventions that have happened. I've benefited from a lot of those when I was growing up, and there were ones, ways that we could have made them better. But when it comes to policy, when it comes to the fiscal, rather reshaping that question to say that we should be more, the first thing that we need to be thinking about is what's actually happening on the ground, what is the reaction, and then support the on the ground people in addition to allocating a budget. And I think when you do that and you center the actual experience and how people are reacting to things, I think even the quality of the spend of the budget will be improved. Maybe we'll know better, why did this hospital not get built, or this health facility not get built in time? What was the issue? So yeah, it's just about, rather than starting with the policy, the budget policy, that's very important. I mean, it's the work that I do, but to really understand what's actually happening and how can we make, our policy react or responsive and proactive also to what's actually happening on the ground, and what grassroots organizations and what people are doing, how are they reacting and responding to these crises. Thank you.
Cheers. In other words, centering those marginalized, those that are experiencing these problems, which really helps me to go towards our final question, which basically encourages a reflection on the principles that should underpin the vision for the future, and sort of emphasize the importance of learning from the past to shape a better tomorrow. So that question becomes, in envisioning a future that prioritizes economic and climate justice, how can we ensure that the principles of sustainability, social equity, human rights, that they guide our policies and practices and decision-making processes? How can we learn from past mistakes and actively work towards a more just and sustainable future for all in South Africa and the world? Cheers.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to wrap up how we initially started the conversation is, and I think I saw it on a t-shirt by the CJCs, that we don't want climate change, we want system change. And it's really about if there's anything you take away from what we've been talking about, is to not use the same thinking, the same colonial mindset, or the same lack-based, fear-based mentality of oh, it's me versus that person. I know I sound quite airy-fairy hippie, but it goes against the underlying assumptions of economics. But we should think beyond that and think well, why aren't we creating an economic system that reflects our lived reality and the real, what it actually means to be a human being on this earth? And so, yeah, if there's anything, is to really change the way that we think and expand it, and think bigger than what we're used to. And the best way to do that is to really understand what's going on, but to also is to speak to and engage with different people in the country, different people, and the people who are most carry those burdens, to understand like how they've been carrying that and what ideas do they have. And I think when you center that and you recognize like, oh, we don't want to entrench gender inequality, we don't want to entrench various other identity markers, we don't want inequality at all. How do we do that? We listen to the people who are most affected by it because they know how, you know, how it actually manifests. And if we make policies that are centered that way, I think that will be an opportunity to really, you know, actually have a transition, a just transition, but also rectify the wrongs or the things that they've missed in our first transition into a democratic state. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your response there, because it speaks to very much, how do you say, boots on the ground, right? Like, we can be very theoretical. We can speak from, you know, especially when we come from decolonial perspectives or perspectives that seemingly come from the academy or the university, and that leaves this gap, right? And that gap we've seen since '94. These justice questions are not new, right? The just transition is just another way of saying the same thing what we were talking about in '94, you know, transitioning to a just democracy. It's a just transition. You know, today you have, you know, different political parties speaking to, you know, just economics, really, right? Like, so these questions are old. So I really appreciate, and thank you very much for being here and having this discussion with us and talking to us from, you know, a perspective of someone that's researching this stuff. Thank you very much. Admin, how are we doing? What's next?
Yeah, I think we need to open up to the floor, and we have some questions in the Q&A. I think maybe we should start with those, and if people have questions in the audience, then also they can raise their hands, and we can go to those after we've answered the ones in the Q&A section. How does that sound? Great.
Yeah.
Do you want me to read them out, or Lungisa, maybe you can start? Can you see the question and answer panel at the bottom?
Well, is the first question Tondorai?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So, all right. So, Sidi, let me ask you the first question. Achieving economic justice will likely require a multi-faced and collaborative approach that takes into account a wide range of social, economic, and political factors. What are the strategies that can be used to address inequalities and injustice in South Africa?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Tondorai. So, I mean, you know, we've spoken quite at length about it, and I guess because of the work that I do, I've seen the power that fiscal policy and budget allocations have in protecting or threatening the realization of human rights, particularly education and healthcare. So one strategy that I advocate towards, firstly, is the national budget and shaping it. And we live in a country like in South Africa where, yes, we have many issues, but one thing that we're doing very well is that there's more opportunity than in other countries to participate in shaping the budget. So and you know, I encourage everyone who's listening to really be part of like Parliament submissions, and like I think you can get it on Parliamentary Monitoring Group or Parliament itself. So after the national budget, a week after, there's Parliament and like the South African people, anyone can log in online, can ask questions to National Treasury about like, you know, why did you cut funding towards this? What about this? You know, so like that kind of participation in shaping that. If there's still, I think last year and the year before, there were pre-budget submissions that people can make. And, you know, you don't have to be technical, high level, or like be 30 pages or something. It can be like 1 page. It can be just be you expressing how you'd like the budget to be shaped. So I think that that's one of the strategies that we can use, because often, and I've learned that when we don't speak about, like when, you know, sometimes I'm like, what's the point of me saying all of this? But when I don't speak about education or healthcare, it gets overlooked in the budget, and not completely, but like in the National Treasury spaces. So it really takes let's take advantage of some of the things that have been working in terms of our democracy and use that to our advantage to address that, and also hold governments accountable for underspending. Right now, there's a lot of underspending in healthcare in the Department of Health and in basic education, in terms of, in some provinces have had to return funding that was supposed to get rid of pit latrine toilets, and then expanding this to also the just energy transition. One of the ways, the things I've noticed that they always talk about is how they're so open to, they want consultation. And if you can like follow those people online on Twitter or something, to just address, bring it out, like air your concerns and see what's happening, like be part of, like don't be afraid, like that's that's your right, like that's what was fought for, like there are people who have died for our rights to be able to at least contribute and like air our voices, and yeah, like that's just how I feel. It's just like public participation as well as like wielding the power of fiscal policy. I hope that answered your question, Tonderai.
Yeah, and I'd just like to jump onto that too, because the point of having this conversation and using the different frameworks of human rights, SDGs, and the Constitution is precisely to deal with that question. Is that those are the frameworks that we have. They may not be working very well. Let's also remember that even though I'm very, decolonial, I'm competitive when it comes to those frameworks. I think they don't work. I think they're inherently flawed. At the same time, these are the frameworks we do have, right? So if you want to deal with injustice and deal with those things, you have to look at those frameworks and critique them. Cheers. Second question. Yes, this name is Pamoti. What practical steps do you propose for connecting the work underway on the JET with the emerging campaigns concerning first, government's aggressive fiscal consolidation austerity program, number two, debt for climate and its implications for delivery of public goods and services, bearing in mind that SA's sovereign debt is at about 75% of GDP, and we are approaching 20% of annual GDP on servicing interest.
Yeah, those are
question. Cheers.
Yeah, that's definitely the kind of question that those are the things that are in my mind as well. And I'm also open to other ways, like here to hear from other people who've been part of the JP process in shaping that. It's a huge concern, our aggressive fiscal consolidation. Budget cuts are a real thing in government. I think we can see it. Teachers are not getting paid what they should be getting. Hospitals are nurses are overworked and underpaid and understaffed, and it's a real problem. And then we spend most of the biggest part of our budget goes towards interest on debts, and now we're taking on even more debts. It's like, so how do we do that? And I think those are the kind of questions that we should be asking when we participate. So I think the Presidential Climate Commission tends to have like some of their meetings are available for like open for people to participate in. And I think those are the spaces we should be asking these questions, because, those are some of the ways that we can do that. And I think also another practical step is to reel in Parliament. So Parliament submissions, addressing Parliament, writing letters to the different committees of Parliament and being like, yo, what's going on? We said that we have so much debt and now we're taking on even more debt. And that was the reason why we're not spending as much as we should on other government spaces. Like, what does that mean? And just holding government to account. I hope that is practical enough, but yeah, like public participation, just take what has been working, what we can get from, what has, like we have taken in a democratic society, and use those tools to like shape the world that we actually do want to see next year.
Absolutely. To add on to that also, we also have to remember the history that comes, right, pre-94, the structural adjustment programs. We've got to look at Brentwood's conferences, like World War II. We got to see the world, how it's moved, the how do you say, trade, right, in the world. where South Africa is at, it's not accidental, it's not natural, it's not incidental, it just happened just because these are structures that have been put into place by global forces, and we have to understand why those things are happening. So when you ask that question and you're asking about GDP, we also have to ask the question, why do we use GDP as a measurement, right? Like, what's the point of GDP? Who does it serve? Your question is really, really good. And I'm sorry, I can't see it anymore in front of me, so I can't answer it properly. But the point that I wanted to make is that we have to understand the history of the economics that we're dealing with. And thank you very much, Chidi, for what you were saying there, because you're speaking to, you know, the budget stuff that's happening in the world right now. But the point that I want to make out, maybe it's a little bit theoretical, but we have to understand the history of the space we're in today as South Africans. It's not accidental. You got to look at structural adjustment programs. You got to look at Brentwood's conferences. You got to look at World War II and the effects of that on world economy. Right. Cheers. Next question, as per Mehdi again, panelists, what are the specific reforms or should we be proposing for reforming the global financial system to build an economic justice platform that is firmly embedded in climate action? Could you speak to specific inputs required to stimulate local demand, ground up to Pretoria, as well as global supply in MDBs and DFIs?
I think regarding like local demand, inputs to local demand and global supply, I may not have the range for that, but I will reflect on the specific reforms and actually even like pose that question back, is that, you know, is reform enough? Like, if we do implement reforms, like, and I'll give you examples of reforms that we're advocating for: gender responsive budgeting, human rights based budgeting, decolonization, centering marginalized communities, participatory policy making, all those things. Those are like, you know, good ways or tools to achieve that. But I think ultimately the question, like in terms of, yeah, in building, in achieving like adequate climate action, but, you know, we then ask ourselves, like, you know, we can scream and shout to South Africa's government in a global economic system where some countries who have the funding have a little bit more power, or maybe a lot more power. And what does that mean? Like, even if we reform South Africa and reform our government, like, will that trickle down? Because now, for instance, we're taking on debt, which I'm not completely anti-debt, but like in the context of this, it just seems like, what doesn't really make sense. It sounds like we're making it the next generation's problem, like climate change is their problem, but also for them to carry the burden. So we should be asking, like, can we actually reform a global system like that, where some people have more power, some countries have more power than others? So yeah, I'm sorry that that I have a question to your question, but yeah, that's I think it's worth thinking about.
If I was going to jump in there, my response, and it's out there on the radical systems change, there are no reforms for this economic system. We're talking about capitalism here. Capitalism cannot be reformed, and that's not to say that I think there's some type of socialism or communism that's going to take it. These systems to me lie on the same continuum. What we're about here in Africa and other colonized spaces, we have to remember that we had our own economic systems, ways of being in the world, and that were localized. And this is maybe something I can jump onto that speaks to the SDGs, because one of the criticisms of SDGs is that it speaks too much to the global ideas and globalizations. And one of the ideas around changing it is localization, is speaking to what do the local spaces need, instead of looking to the larger framework of globalization. Remembering, of course, that the larger framework of globalization is not our framework, right? It's their framework. And obviously I say they, I'm speaking to those that bring colonialism to us. Cheers. And also to speak to the part where you say here, reforming the global financial system. Yeah, you can't reform the global financial system. It just has to go. Cheers. Okay. Anonymous attendee, panelist, does the world have the resources required to fund climate action? If your response is yes, will they reach the global south? You mentioned that SA battles with the implementation of sound policy and legislation, even with the resources to address climate change. Will South Africa succeed in amending current legislation to mitigate and react to climate-related disasters? Will it succeed in implementing its policies? If not, what can be done differently? Okay. Please don't let this question go. Leave it on, admin.
Okay, so thank you, Anonymous, for that question. So I definitely do think that we have the resources required to fund climate action. I think that we live in a society that tells us that, there's a lot of lack and it's competition, and I think that's one of the theories that underpins like our capitalist economy. If I go back to first year economics modules, like the first lessons they teach you is like there's no such thing as a free lunch, or there's an opportunity cost for everything, right? And those are like interesting assumptions to build an economic system, but then the actual reality of the day-to-day that we live in is that, they actually, like my view is that, people do things outside of just wanting to, people are not that self-interested. And, I guess I'm biased because, South African, and we have our philosophy is more about Ubuntu, and not to, be cheesy about it, but, it's a different way of thinking, and it's worth questioning or interrogating that way of thinking. So I do think that we do have the resources. We actually have so much abundance in the world. The problem is like how we allocate those resources. We have some people, individually, we have people who are worth allegedly over $100 billion. And then we have the majority of the world that's like below the food poverty line. And then also, like countries, some countries are just so wealthy. I was in Luxembourg last year, and they have like free public transports and everything is free. And, people there are really, really wealthy. And then, other parts of the world, it's just, genuinely like abject poverty. And those are really like entrenched legacies of colonialism. But we do have resources. It's just about how we've allocated them and the assumptions that we've made in allocating our resources in the way that we have. And then I did mention South Africa's implementation battle with implementing policy and legislation, even with the resources. Will South Africa succeed in amending the current legislation and in its reaction to climate change disasters? So, it depends. It's looking quite dire and pessimistic, I think, but I still see this just energy transition as an opportunity to do things right. So one example is like with the JETP, in terms of the funding or accepting how it's funded, like, we could, for the first time, require Parliament, a democratic process, and whether we accept international debt or not, we could, Parliament could be responsible for that. In that sense, or like, there should be like participation in that way. And there are like things like gender responsive budgeting that are working, and some government departments are better than others in implementing policies. But overall, if we do center people who experience the greatest burden, like the people who carry the biggest burden, and we center their experiences and make sure that they're the ones who are most protected, and we change our way of thinking radically, I think that we can position ourselves as a country and as a race, a human race, in responding to climate change. That answer. Thank you.
Yeah, Anonymous Comrade. I'm looking at your question, and I'm thinking even the framing of it is kind of problematic, right? Like, so does the world have the resources required to fund climate action? Well, of course it does. If your response is yes, will they reach the global south? Chance is no, because of the way the systems are set up, right? And that's part of the work that we're trying to do right now, is to change those things. These systems and structures and frameworks they're a long time being set up, and this is why we go towards colonialism, and we use colonialism as a background framework to speak to the problems we have today, because these problems are not random. Jonga, do we have the resources? Of course we have. South Africa is one of the most richest resource countries in the world, and it also happens to be the most unequal country in the world. What does that tell you about the framework of the economic system that we have, right? So you say SA battles with the implementation of sound policy and legislation. Of course it does, right? I'm speaking to that there are outside forces, right? Like we are stuck. When the IMF gives us with conditions, right? They come and they tell us you cannot do this, you cannot do that. I say that also to speak to the fact that in my background, I mean, I've got 20 plus years of working in hospitality and service industry. So I know for a fact that in the world, in South Africa, that the resources are there. It's just that we can't get at them. And the legislation can be amended. We just need folk that are brave enough, courageous enough to change the system, right? This is why we call for systems change and not climate change. Cheers. Matshidiso Ngapi, you are gone. Are you still there?
I'm sorry, I just wanted to improve the bandwidth.
Oh, no worries, no worries. Okay, so Sikwatlane has got another question. I hope I answered the one before properly. Dead for climate. It strikes me that we are faced with the contradiction of demands. Young people are telling us that if we don't take rapid climate action at scale, we are risking their future. This is bearing itself out in the changing regime of international trade, which affects industrialization, jobs, income, and the real economy. Second, local campaigners are saying we need to slow down the transition. Sorry, let me just fix this. Local campaigners are saying we need to slow down the transition and question whether we can even absorb the debt associated with development financing required to make the transition we need. However, concessional IPG packages. So really, what are we actually saying are the pathways that lead us to an appropriate response to the global energy transition that is underway now, including the changing order of trade, which will only worsen the status quo if we aren't clear about the action we need to take today. What does the decolonial shift look like in practical terms at the negotiating table right now? Decarbonization, climate action, energy transition, trade. Great question.
Yes, I agree. Also a great question. But I'll try to keep my answer short because maybe there might be people, give other people an opportunity to ask.
Yeah, we're running out of time too.
Okay, great. It is a difficult one. And we find ourselves in quite a conundrum. But I'm looking at it from a policy level and from a funding allocation thing, like we can entrench or capacitate ourselves to build, to center, or maybe not even center, but increase our advocacy as young people or as campaigners to really reflect on the budget. So I think a lot of times, rightfully so, it does reflect on legislation, on and human rights. But I think also that gives economists and policymakers a bit of a cop-out where they don't generally end up being as held to account as other policymakers. And so we have maybe that political freedom, but then the economic side of things doesn't follow through as well. So I think that's one of maybe a practical way is to start thinking about when we do our advocacy is utilizing the public participation and advocacy around the budget. As for what does the decolonial shift look like in practical terms? So, I mean, I think I explored it earlier during the Q&A that one of the ways that we could have a decolonial one is, it's just to sit and reflect on what has been working in the past before. If we think about colonization, there are a lot of assumptions about it, but one of the assumptions is that the colonized people were inherently stupid, or they were savages, noble, their words, not mine. And there were concepts like the white man's burden, or we need to help these these Africans and Asians and indigenous people because
less than human,
less than human. And so those things, without actually actively addressing that, and when we start looking back to our ancestors and the people who came before us as that, we're actually entrenching that colonial way of thinking, which is also a problem that has happened in Europe, because this is not the first time this kind of colonization has happened. There were Romans and Vikings who colonized maybe more indigenous English people, or like people who lived there. And today, you know, a lot of those those practices are not really carried through. And maybe, you know, like one of the ways that we can be decolonial is even just our approach to how we view what do you call it? How we view indigenous like knowledge systems. And it doesn't have to be as complicated as like going to the University of Pretoria to do astronomy in Setswana, which I do recommend, but it can also just be like literally looking at thinking about, so what was education really like? What did they think about healthcare? What did they think about like gender? And seeing like what could we be taking from that? Just a like quick little one is, before in my past lifetime, I actually had the privilege to work with Mama Graça Machel, and she was really, really obsessed with indigenous knowledge systems. And I didn't get it at the time. I was young, like not that I was against it, but I was like, oh yeah, sure. But I couldn't understand how that could be practical. And she would say like she was the first, you know, Minister of Education in Mozambique. And one of the things that they did, like I think that she increased her tenure, like the literacy rates increased by like 70%, and there were all these policies and stuff that were implemented really well. And she always says like, before you think like, in order to be progressive, like don't just like think about what let me think of this like really great idea. Let's actually look back at what worked in the past that was done well, that maybe was a threat to this current global system order, colonial system, that you can actually implement, and maybe that can help with implementing like policies on education and healthcare. So those are, I think, that's an example of how to make decolonization more practical.
Yeah, I appreciate what you just said, because your answers are always so practical, actually. But I want to hit that, like these questions, you say like young people are telling us if we don't take rapid climate action at scale, we are risking their future. I'm very quick to point out that one of the colonial ways of conquering divide is to separate the youth from their elders, right? So we'll say things like, oh, the youth's future, right? What are you talking about, right? Like, it's not the youth's future, it's our future, right? That's my blood, that's my baby, that's my, right? Like, and so there's this way of how we, you know, the relationship that we have with reality and the world and the present is so colonial that it makes us ask these. I'm not saying that the question you're asking is absolutely colonial. It's not about risking their future, it's about risking the future, right? And part of that problem is that that's a colonial problem. That's what colonization did. Colonization secured white futurities, right? It secured the future for white folk, for settlers, right? If we're speaking specifically to this settler colonial state. So how do we this is bearing itself out in the changing regime of international trade, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, of course it is, right? Like, because the thing is that they've now found a way to speak to us in terms of separation. Now the youth is freaking out, telling us elders, you guys are stealing up. No, I'm not stealing your future, bro. Right? It's the system. Local campaigners are saying we need to slow down the transition. And yeah, well, of course they are, right? This system change now. Freedom now, not tomorrow, not no, now. And yes, there will be a price to pay for that. We understand that. And I come from a very hardcore radical decolonial perspective, right? Black tradition of radicalness. That's where I come from. So yes, it's going to be harsh. It's going to be hard. That's just a given. But what isn't? Look at the world right now. Okay, I'm going to get biographical. I mean, I was just broken into yesterday. Things are getting hard. Children that I saw that were begging at my house just like a month ago are gone. They disappeared. I worry about where they are. Things are getting bad. There's no like, oh, let's do a soft move here. That doesn't work. So, and also, what does the decolonial shift look like? To speak to decolonialism, you're speaking to a fundamental change of the system, right? So what does that look like? I'm not really sure that anybody really knows. We have ideas and we have our imagination. And again, I'm speaking on the theoretical perspective. Matshidiso speaks to the practical. I'm speaking to the theory here now. No, I don't think anybody really knows like what that decolonial change will look like. But what we do know is that we want to transition to it, right? Because this colonial version doesn't work and we know where it leads. We've watched it for 600 years. Okay, so that's where I'm at with that answer. Are there any more questions?
There's like one more at the bottom
One.
by Misha. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just trying to use this. Mishak, globalization to me is the issue because we're being dictated by the West. They're not complying with climate change laws that were agreed upon. We need to hold them accountable. Africa is rich, but who benefits? That kind of encompasses the whole thing, right? The conversation we're having, right? Like, do you want to
That's a
respond to
good
that?
way to, actually a pretty good way to conclude it, because like the climate justice thing is like, we don't want climate change, we want system change. And globalization and the West, it is true, like they are actually dictating, and they can continue to dictate us, if they keep us in debt, it does threaten our sovereignty, because we might, like they have history, I think we know from like the 70s, about structural reform. So maybe, being in support of this aggressive fiscal consolidation, but we as a country might not want that. So it is, I do agree I think we all do that, we are the richest continent, rich in everything, rich in resources, rich in like the people, the culture, everything. But unfortunately, like we're not treated, we're being exploited, which is a great, must be really sad for Mother Earth. And also, I think we were talking, Lungisa, I just want to like just wrap this one up, is that, today, like there are things that we take for granted on our continent that we like, if you're African, you have like a totem, maybe you're from the Tlo people, it's an elephant or whatever, that you can actually trace that animal, like it's still alive, and we still have our nature, like we still have our wild animals roaming around, we still can enjoy some of the things that our ancestors had enjoyed. But then, when you look at like who colonizes us and who makes decisions on how we fix that, it's like, oh, but clearly something that we've been doing for thousands of years has been working. Why completely discard that? Maybe bring back some ownership in the way that we respond to protecting our, in natural resources. So yeah, like we're rich in minerals, but in everything. But then, there's a global order that has like, completely.
Yeah, 100%. Let me say it more forcefully. Globalization, I mean, as a word, it's become so universalized, but let's understand what it actually means. It means Western hegemony, right? Like they benefit. Globalization is an old concept. People have been around, have been traveling. I mean, there's this whole story of immigration right now where we're all acting as if people just started to move around the world, right? Like, no, we've been doing this, right? And and the issue is because you're being dictated by the West. Yes, of course, right? Like this is not this conversation needs to be real, right? These people will kill you if you don't follow what they say. And if you don't believe me, look at the history. Look at who they've killed who didn't listen, right? Like, and this is the fact of the West, right? If we, like you say here, they're not complying with climate change laws that were agreed upon. These laws that they go out there and they spend millions on these conferences, but none of the things that they decide are binding. Not a single one. I mean, you look at the COPs. The COPs are a joke. Nothing is binding when it comes to these folk, right? So it's all ridiculous. And we as Africa, we as Africans, we as brown and black folk of the world, indigenous, racialized, black, we need to understand that colonialism isn't just a theory. It is something that has destroyed us. Colonialism is about separation, right? Like we speak about climate change and the separation of us from nature. That is not accidental. Ways of being that had relationships with nature were destroyed or are being destroyed. We're still here, right? Anyway, let me stop there. But I just wanted to say to Mishak, yeah, you're absolutely right. I absolutely agree with what you're saying there. Cheers. Tara has her hand up. Go ahead,
I
Tara.
just wanted to say that we need to maybe wrap up because we're over time, and I'm cognizant of the fact that we said we would finish at 2:30. So maybe if we can just ask if there are any last questions and then wrap up.
Yeah. Anybody got any last questions? Thank you for all the questions, by the way. They're really interesting. I think we're done there, Tara.
Great. Then I think, yeah, you can wrap up and we can end.
Is that going to be on me?
Yeah, just maybe you can say a little bit about the next
Yeah.
series in
So
general.
besides thanking everybody that was here today, thank you very much. That was like, I really enjoyed that conversation. Thanks, Chidi. That was fun. And I want to say that this is the first of 6 webinars, and the concept note for these webinars is Planting the Seeds of Justice, an introductory webinar series for Climate Justice Coalition members. So this was for us as members of the coalition, but obviously we opened it up to the public, and I'm really hoping that everybody got something out of this, because for me, I got a lot out of what Chidi had to say. Today's session was called The Promise of Fairness. I hope we stuck to that, and that we gave you guys not a foundational, but a nice foundational theoretical understanding of how do you say the frameworks that are being used in this country, from your human rights ideas, your SDGs, and the Constitution, and how they basically. They are frameworks that have been used, but they're not necessarily that good. They can be critiqued, but they are functional for us right now. So our next session will be called the Symphony of Systems, a macroscopic view of economics. This session will provide an overview of macroeconomic principles and how they relate to economic justice. Participants will gain an understanding of economic systems and how they shape economic outcomes. This session will also explore the implications of economic policies on African economies and how they have contributed to economic injustices. That's our next session. We'll have a session 3, feminist economics, solidarity and K-economics. Session 4 will be about sustainable development, moving beyond growth and prioritizing environmental protection and social justice. Session 5 will be called Harmony with the Earth, basically redefining economics through an ecological and degrowth lens. Our last session, session 6, is called Healing the Past, Building the Future, Decolonization and Reparations for Economic Justice. That's the basic breakdown of the 6 sessions, and I hope you enjoyed this first one and that you'll join us for the rest. Thanks a lot, everybody. And thank you to the admin and everybody that helped us produce this today. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Lucy, I think we can stop recording.
Yeah, we're just gonna hang on a bit. Yeah.
Yeah.
to-
Yeah.
They
Curious
need-
to hear your guys' opinions.